I still remember that autumn morning when the maple trees were covered in brilliant red, each leaf swirled in the cool breeze, and the warm yellow sunlight painted soft contours on the roofs of Brookside Estates. The space seemed as quiet and peaceful as it had been for years, as if nothing had ever changed. But I was wrong. Peace, it turns out, is just a fragile shell. And in a community run by a powerful homeowners association, HOA, that peace can never last forever. This is a story of secrets, conflicts, and a relentless fight for justice, if you want to know how the truth is revealed. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes. I, Robert Caldwell, have lived here for over a decade. As mayor of the town, I know every street, every roof, and even the smallest changes in this residential area. But even in my high-ranking position, I am not immune to the harsh rules of the HOA, especially when it is run by Linda Harper, a woman who is tough, meticulous, and perhaps more power-hungry than anyone I have ever met. The trouble started when I decided to build a small shed in my backyard. I didn't think much of it. It was just a simple structure. It served my storage needs, and most importantly, it didn't bother anyone. But just a few days after it was completed, I received my first letter from the HOA. Written in black and white, strongly worded, the letter insisted that my shed did not comply with the HOA's aesthetic standards. I had to tear it down or make it conform. At the time, I laughed. I was the mayor of this town, and I couldn't imagine being dragged into such a trivial dispute. I ignored the letter. After all, my shed was tucked away in the backyard, and it didn't bother my neighbors. But a week later, another letter arrived, this time with a warning of fines. I was starting to get annoyed. Didn't the HOA have anything more important to do than dig up a shed? I decided to ignore it once more, but Linda Harper wasn't one to give up easily. Within a month, I had received a series of notices from the HOA, each one increasingly aggressive in tone. Linda didn't stop at just paperwork. She came to see me in person, standing right in front of my house, her eyes piercing as she demanded immediate action. She cited a series of clauses in the neighborhood code, stating that if I didn't comply, I would be evicted. I looked at her, calm but not without anger. This wasn't my first time dealing with stubborn people, but I never expected to have to deal with an HOA as the second political force in town. I tried to compromise. I offered to repaint the shed, put in a new roof, even hire an architect to make it more in harmony with the neighborhood. But Linda Harper wouldn't have it. She wanted it gone, a show of force that I couldn't accept. I knew the motives behind it. It wasn't just a matter of aesthetics, it was a power struggle. Linda wanted to make it clear that even if I was mayor, I would still have to bow to the HOA, which was essentially her. What had seemed like a small issue quickly turned into a simmering war. I began to notice a change in the way my neighbors viewed me. Some who had previously been friendly became distant. HOA meetings became more heated, with quickly passed articles restricting homeowner rights, all aimed at me. I began to realize that this was no longer a fight over a shed. It was a real confrontation between me and Linda Harper, between the political power I wielded and the invisible but powerful influence of the HOA. And the worst part was that I had no advantage in this fight. I can't say I was surprised that the HOA continued to target me, but the extent and manner in which Linda Harper and her organization did so was beyond anything I could have imagined. At first, I thought the dispute over the shed was a simple aesthetic issue, a small power struggle between Linda and me, but I was wrong. I quickly realized that this was more than just a demand that I remove a structure. This was a war, and I was the target. The warning letters didn't stop at just repairing or demolishing the shed. The HOA started sending out regular violation notices, each time citing a new reason, each time with a higher fine. At first, it was an aesthetic issue with the shed. They said the paint didn't match the neighborhood's code. I repainted it. Then they said the roof wasn't up to code. I replaced the roof. But soon enough another letter came, this time citing the shed's size as being too large for its intended area. The funny thing was, there was no ordinance that specified the square footage limit for an accessory structure, and when I looked up the HOA's documents, I discovered that the provision had been added shortly after I finished the shed. When I protested, they changed tactics. They no longer targeted the shed, but began scrutinizing my entire property. One day I received a notice that my front lawn was not mowed to HOA standards. It must be kept no higher than 3 inches. I couldn't believe my eyes when I read the notice. 3 inches? Who measures these things? But that wasn't all. A few days later, they sent another warning about a section of my fence that was off by 5 degrees. Then they mentioned the paint color on my front door, claiming it didn't fit the traditional Brookside Estates color palette. Little by little, the HOA strangled me with its own set of unreasonable rules. But what angers me most is their true intentions. The warehouse is more than just a personal archive for me. It contains important documents about the town's history, records, maps, and planning documents from generations past that I have spent years collecting and preserving. It is an invaluable archive not just to me, but to anyone interested in the history of Brookside Estates. Linda Harper and the HOA know that, and I believe they don't want to get rid of the warehouse simply because it's an aesthetic or code violation. They want to get rid of it because of the documents inside, because the information may not fit the vision they want to impose on the town. The fines started piling up. I was told that if I didn't pay, the HOA had the right to place a lien on my house, a move that would allow them to take possession of my property if I didn't comply. I was no longer a private citizen being harassed by the HOA. I was a mayor being controlled by this tiny organization, and I knew that if I caved, I would become a textbook example to anyone who dared to defy them. Linda Harper didn't just want me to tear down the shed. She wanted me to cave in, to accept that the HOA had ultimate power, even over the mayor of this town. I didn't give up easily, but I couldn't deny that the pressure from the HOA was growing. Some neighbors began to avoid me, perhaps out of fear of being implicated. HOA meetings became mini courts, where every time I spoke out against something, I was overruled by new, arbitrarily created rules. I saw a consensus among HOA board members who were either manipulated by Linda or completely sold on her ideal of absolute control. But I couldn't back down. That barn wasn't just a building, it was a piece of history, a symbol of the values I believed in, and if they thought I would let them take it down, they had underestimated me. This battle had only just begun. As the battle between me and the HOA escalated, I braced myself for what they would do next. I knew they wouldn't stop at unreasonable fines or threats of civil disobedience, but I didn't expect what would happen that fateful night. The night when everything I had worked so hard to protect would be consumed by flames. It was a quiet, uneventful night. A gentle breeze blew through the changing maple trees, and streetlights cast shadows on the deserted streets of Brookside Estates. I was still awake, sitting in my study, poring over the documents I had spent my life collecting and preserving. Old maps, rare photos of the town from the last century, detailed records of the development of Brookside Estates. All were pieces of a larger story, a story I knew the HOA didn't want anyone to talk about. The siren blared in the night, startling me. The acrid smell of smoke filled every corner. I rushed into the backyard, and the sight before me stunned me. My shed was on fire. The flames were raging, consuming every piece of wood, every roof, and every precious thing I had stored inside. I rushed forward, but the heat prevented me from getting any closer. The fire had not been an accident, I knew that immediately, Neighbors woke up, spilling into the streets in anxious chatter. Fire trucks arrived shortly afterward, but I knew there was nothing they could do. I stood there, watching the fire burn everything, watching the flames reflected in the eyes of the people around me, including Linda Harper, who stood with her arms folded in the distance, showing no surprise or grief. It was not the look of someone who was surprised. It was the look of someone who knew what was coming. When the last flames died down, I stepped through the smoldering ashes, my heart heavy. Nothing was left. Not a single page, not a single map, not a single photograph that could be saved. Everything I had held on to for years, evidence of the town's past, documents that I knew the HOA wanted to bury, was now ash. I clenched my fists, fighting back the anger that was rising inside me. I knew this was no accident. There was no heat source in the warehouse that could have ignited the fire. I was always careful, especially with such an important structure, but I had no proof. No one had seen anything, no obvious traces, and I knew the HOA wouldn't leave any clues behind. They were smarter than that. I could sense Linda Harper's invisible hand behind this, but I couldn't prove it. And that's what drives me the most mad, the helplessness before a force that can manipulate everything without leaving a trace. In the days after the fire, the HOA remained suspiciously silent. No condolences, no signs of concern, just the stoic faces of people who knew they had gotten what they wanted. But I couldn't let this go. I couldn't let them win by turning everything I held dear to me to dust. Even without immediate evidence, I vowed to find out the truth. I wouldn't let this fire be written off as a mere accident. This was more than an act of vandalism, it was a declaration of war. And if they thought the fire would extinguish my spirit, they were mistaken. I may have lost the warehouse, but I hadn't lost everything. This battle was far from over. I couldn't let this end quietly. The fire had burned down not only my warehouse, but everything I had tried to protect. But it had not burned down my resolve. If they thought they could break me like this, they were making a grave mistake. In the days after the fire, I kept my cool, carefully observing the HOA's movements. I didn't confront them head-on. I didn't accuse anyone without evidence. I knew what I needed to do. I needed the truth, and I needed to expose them using the same rules they had used to oppress me. I wasn't just a resident, I was the mayor of this town. I had the power, I had the connections, and most of all, I had a reason to keep going. I began a systematic investigation. I enlisted friends in local government, legal experts, and journalists with experience exposing organizations that manipulate communities. What I found was far more than I had imagined. HOAs are more than just neighborhood organizations with harsh rules. They are a hidden power structure, run by people who know how to extract benefits from the very communities they claim to protect. I found the first clues when I reviewed HOA financial records. They were collecting hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in fines and maintenance fees, but there was no transparency about how that money was spent. Some expenses were listed vaguely, like landscape maintenance or community management fees. But there was no evidence that the money was actually spent as intended. Instead, I uncovered unusual financial transactions involving several individuals on the HOA board, including Linda Harper. The signs of corruption became increasingly clear as my investigation expanded. I discovered that the HOA had manipulated real estate prices in the area, deliberately making it difficult for some homeowners to sell their properties at prices below their true value. These homes were then resold to people with connections to the HOA or transferred through real estate companies affiliated with some of the board members. This was no longer a minor violation of the rules, but a system of organized profiteering, a sophisticated web of corruption that was manipulating the entire community. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that my barn fire was no random event. It was part of a larger plan, a plan to silence anyone who dared to challenge the HOA. They had done this before. Residents who had challenged them had faced the same troubles: unreasonable fines, indirect threats, bogus property investigations. Some were forced to leave, others settled, but no one had the strength to stand up to them until now. I knew I needed more than just initial findings. I needed hard evidence, irrefutable documents, and testimonies that held weight. I approached residents who had been bullied by HOAs, listened to their stories, collected the documents they had kept. I sought out legal experts to better understand the HOA's violations. I even sought out former HOA members, people who had been in the system but had left because they could no longer participate in the organization's shady dealings. And it didn't take me long to discover that Linda Harper wasn't acting alone. She had allies in local government who either turned a blind eye to what the HOA was doing, or worse, benefited from its shady dealings. I knew I couldn't rush things. If I struck too soon, they would find a way to cover their tracks. If I waited too long, they could do more damage. But I had accepted this fight the moment they decided to burn down my warehouse. And this time I wasn't alone. I had evidence, I had allies, and most importantly, I was ready to fight back. I knew that exposing the HOA was only part of the plan. The truth, no matter how powerful, wouldn't change a deeply entrenched system if I didn't have a way to control it from within. They had the laws, they had the power, and most importantly, they had absolute control over this neighborhood. If I simply attacked from the outside, they would find a way to turn things around, just as they had done to other residents. I needed a different strategy, an approach that would not only defeat them, but leave them unable to recover, and I realized that the only way to do that was to take HO from them. I began to dig deeper into the organizational structure of the HOA. Despite presenting itself as a representative organization for residents, HOAs were not as democratic as they claimed. They were run by a management company, an independent business entity that had the power to make most of the financial and administrative decisions of the HOA. The HOA board was just a political front. The real power lay with the people who controlled the management company, and that was their biggest weakness. I leveraged all my financial connections, mobilized resources from business partners, and used a significant portion of my personal assets to begin the process of taking over the HOA management company. This was not an immediate process. I needed to keep my plans secret from Linda Harper or anyone on the HOA board. If they knew I was aiming to gain control from within, they would do everything they could to stop me. I took a strategic approach. First, I bought back shares from retail investors who were frustrated with the way the HOA was run and were willing to sell if the price was right. Then, I approached influential members of the management company, offering them deals they couldn't refuse. I didn't buy the whole company all at once. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I slowly increased my control, piece by piece, share by share, until I had enough power to make the big decision. Linda Harper had no idea what was going on. She was still confident that the HOA was untouchable, that she still had all the power. But once I had enough shares, I took the next step, changing the management from within. I replaced key members of the management company with people I trusted, people who were willing to operate transparently and honestly. I brought in legal experts to thoroughly review the HOA's finances, exposing the wrongdoings they had hidden for years, and most importantly, I was prepared to do what no one in this community had ever thought of doing: completely remove Linda Harper from power. When I officially took control of the HOA, I kept quiet for a little while longer, waiting for the right moment to strike. I wanted Linda Harper and her allies to be caught off guard. And then, one morning like any other, I called an emergency HOA meeting. Linda Harper walked into the room with her usual confidence, not knowing that within a few hours, everything she had built would come crashing down. I didn't threaten. I didn't raise my voice. I simply laid out the documents on the table, clear evidence of corruption, abuse of power, and manipulation of the real estate market that the HOA had committed under her direction. And then I did what no one had ever done before. I voted as the new owner of the HOA, removing the entire board of directors. No one could stop me. Linda Harper was removed from the HOA on the spot. Her loyalists were fired or resigned quietly. Within a day, the system they had worked so hard to build was gone. I didn't just defeat them, I replaced them. And this time I would make sure that the HOA could never be used as a tool for abuse of power again. When Linda Harper was removed from the HOA, I knew that I had not yet won. Removing her from power was only the first step. What was more important was to make sure that she and those behind it were held accountable for what they had done. It was not just personal revenge, but justice for all the residents who had been oppressed by the HOA, forced out of their homes, and especially justice for me, who lost everything in the fire they caused. I had it all ready. Over the past months, I had been quietly gathering evidence, tracing the financial, illegal transactions and power struggles that Linda Harper and her associates had been engaging in for years. I had financial records, the shady money that had been moving between the HOA and the real estate companies associated with her. I had testimony from former HOA members who had seen how they had forced homeowners to sell their properties at below-market prices so that the board could profit. I even had evidence of them abusing their power to eliminate dissenting residents, using unreasonable fines to force evictions and assisting developers in illegally evicting properties. But most importantly, I had evidence of the fire. During the investigation, I hired a team of experts to analyze the cause of the fire in my warehouse. The report showed that it was not an accident. There were traces of arson that had been deliberately set. Security cameras around the area which the HOA had declared inoperative the night of the fire had actually recorded people loitering near the warehouse just before the fire broke out. The images were not clear, but I had enough data to track down the person behind it, and it all led back to a group of people with close ties to Linda Harper. I knew the time had come to act. I sent all the documents, reports, and evidence I had to the local prosecutor's office. The police were involved, and within a few days, a formal criminal investigation was opened. I didn't need to go public right away. I wanted to let the facts speak for themselves. But when the police began to summon former members of the HOA for questioning, and when the media began to dig up the secrets they had hidden for years, Linda Harper had nowhere to hide. She tried to fight back. She tried to use old connections to cover up the truth, tried to smear me, even claimed that I had manipulated everything for personal gain. But this time she had no power. Those who had been loyal to her had either left or were trying to save themselves. When the police issued the official arrest warrant, I was there to witness it. Linda Harper was handcuffed in front of the house she had used her power to protect for so many years. Her face no longer had the arrogance of the past, but instead was filled with horror as she realized that the game was up. Her accomplices were also caught. Some were arrested immediately, some tried to escape but were eventually brought to light. Their crimes were not just financial fraud. They were also crimes of malicious destruction of property, abuse of power, and especially of participating in a deliberate fire. As the police took Linda Harper away, I stood there watching, feeling a sense of relief I hadn't felt in a long time. This wasn't just the fall of one person. This was the fall of an unjust system that had been in place for far too long. The HOA had been a tool of manipulation, of oppression, but now it was in my hands, and I would never let it go back to the way it had been. I knew it wouldn't be easy to repair all the damage they had done, but at least for the first time in years, Brookside Estates had a chance to be a real community, no longer manipulated, no longer threatened, and no longer controlled by greed. And I knew that while my warehouse was gone, what I had fought to protect would remain. After Linda Harper was arrested, after the manipulators and profiteers were brought to justice, I knew my fight was not over. Defeating a corrupt system does not automatically mean things will get better. Brookside Estates had suffered too much, not just financially or legally, but more importantly in terms of trust. People had lived under the tight control of a powerful HOA for so long that they had forgotten that they were the ones who had the power to decide the future of this community. If I really wanted to win, I couldn't just tear down what was wrong. I had to rebuild from the ground up. The first thing I did was to completely reform the HOA. I didn't want to leave any remnants of the old system behind, so the entire old board was removed. Those who had assisted Linda Harper, directly or indirectly, were no longer part of the organization. I didn't do this out of spite, but out of necessity. Brookside Estates couldn't continue to function as a tool of control for a small, powerful group. The HOA needed to be restored to its true identity, an organization representing the residents, not a machine that manipulated them. I started holding community meetings, the first time in years that residents had a real voice. I listened to their concerns, their stories of years of oppression, of injustices they had endured. Not everyone believed that change was real. After all that had happened, many remained skeptical, and I didn't blame them. I know that trust cannot be restored by words alone, but by actions. I created a transparent system for the HOA that had never existed before. All income and expenses were public, and every resident had access to financial information and a stake in important decisions. The unreasonable fees that had burdened them were eliminated. The onerous rules that were not designed to protect the community but to control it were completely eliminated. No more silly rules about grass height, door color, or the small details that Linda Harper used to oppress residents. I also pushed for the restoration of what the HOA had destroyed. People who had been forced to sell their homes below their true value. People who had been forced by the HOA to pay unreasonable fines. They were given the help they needed to get back what was theirs. I worked with the government to correct unfair rules, ensuring that no one in Brookside Estates would have to face the same manipulations in the future. But to me, there was one thing that was more important than anything else. I had to rebuild the community. For years, the HOA had not only controlled property, but divided people. Fear had turned neighbors into strangers. I wanted to change that. I encouraged residents to get involved not out of obligation but because they wanted to. I organized community events where people could come together to rebuild the trust that had been lost. One of the last things I did was to plan the rebuilding of the barn, not as a structure but as a symbol of change. I wanted it to be a place that held the history of Brookside Estates, a place where people could come to look back, understand what had gone wrong, and appreciate what they had. Not to remember a rotten HOA, but to remember how they stood up together and took back what was theirs. I know there will be hard times ahead. I know there will be people who are still skeptical, still afraid of what happened. But I also know that this is a new beginning. Brookside Estates is no longer a place where a handful of people can wield power and rule, but a true community where every resident has a voice and a right to decide. And I know, after all, I have not fought in vain. Willow Creek has changed. I can feel it every time I walk down the street, every time I walk along the roads that were once invisible battlefields of control and fear. But now, everything is different. No more wary eyes from neighbors, no more worries about being watched, fined for unreasonable violations, no more domination by a brutal HOA. Willow Creek is not simply freed from the shackles of an unjust system. It is coming back to life in ways I never thought possible. After reforming the HOA, I did not impose my power on the community. I understood that a system is only sustainable when it is run by the people it serves, so I gave the power back to the residents, giving them the opportunity to govern their own neighborhoods democratically. HOA meetings were no longer sham courts where powerful people impose their will on others, but places where people came together to discuss and make decisions for the common good. Every individual in Willow Creek now had a voice, and that was more important than any reform I had ever implemented. The changes went beyond the management structure. A sense of community was restored, as if people were reclaiming what had been lost during years of HOA division. Neighbors who had once been strangers now organized events together and helped each other with daily chores. Children could play on the sidewalks again without being restricted by harsh rules. People could plant small gardens in front of their houses without fear of being warned by the HOA. Willow Creek was finally a place people could actually call home, not a neighborhood overseen by abusive people. I also witnessed a change in how people saw themselves. Residents who had once been resigned, who thought they had no right to protest, now understood that they had the power to change their fate. They no longer feared unreasonable rules, no longer avoided HOA meetings because they thought their voices didn't matter. They had seen what happened when they stood up together, and they knew they would never let anyone take that power away from them again. My barn was rebuilt, but it was more than just a building. It became a community center, a place where people could come to learn about the history of Willow Creek, to understand the mistakes of the past and the lessons learned. It was no longer just my own archive, but the community's shared property. I lost a lot when the fire burned it down, but from the ashes something much bigger was born. I started this fight with anger, with a desire to take revenge on those who destroyed what I loved. But in the end, I realized that what mattered more was not defeating the enemy, but building something better. Willow Creek was not simply freed from oppression. It became a symbol of resilience, of community strength, and of lasting change. I walked the streets I had known for years and saw friendly faces, smiles that had once been covered with fear and apprehension. I knew that the wounds of the past would not disappear immediately, but I also knew that Willow Creek was on the right path, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. I did not fight to remove a tyrant. I fought to give power back to the people who deserved it, and as I watched Willow Creek rise, I knew that my fight had never been in vain.